Good evening. Welcome to a conversation with former Governors Barnes and Deal. Welcome, distinguished guests, family members, students, faculty, friends, and future friends. We are pleased you are here to learn from these political leaders about public service and political civility. At this time, please welcome to the stage Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto, the Tom and Marie Patton Chair of the School of Public Policy, Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts here at Georgia Tech.
Thank you so much. It is my distinct pleasure to be here to welcome you to this event, an event that we need more of. We need to have these types of conversations. I was told that as the chair of the School of Public Policy, I could use this privilege to talk a little bit about what we do at Georgia Tech to enable these conversations and to create pathways to public service for our students. One of the things that we do that's highly relevant to today's talk is we manage the governor's legislative internship program, where we send our talented Georgia Tech students under the Gold Dome for a semester where they can understand how policymaking really works. So we have some of them here today. Can you throw up your hands so we can see you? Excellent. So love these students. We also have a program in DC, which we started 3 years ago, where we take students who live, work, and do internships on the Hill and other governmental agencies. That program has doubled every year in its existence and has over 200 applications for this fall. And that shows you the interest, the demand that these students want to go into public service. They want to work in these spaces. They want to one day sit in these seats. And all of our students from the undergraduate to graduate are going into public service. We also run the Law, Science, and Technology program, which has 150 students who want to go into the legal profession, and they want to do it in order to solve some of the most pressing problems that we have. And one of those problems right now is discourse. So I'm grateful that you are here today to join us in this conversation, to think about civil discourse, and to think about careers in public service. So thank you for being here, and thank you for joining in this collaborative effort. It's my pleasure to introduce Dean Matt Auer, who's the Dean and Arch Professor of Public and International Affairs at our sister school, UGA, School of Public and International Affairs. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I am thrilled to join you today, and thrilled in a variety of ways, including the partnership with the University of West Georgia and Georgia Tech. And they're joining us in something today that we're really excited about. So we're claiming this at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia as an event that's very much in sync with something that we've been working on that my friend Cassie Sugimoto was making reference to as well, and that's this concept of political civility. So Governor Barnes and Governor Deal, we had this concept a few years ago that goes like this. We proposed in our own minds that it serves the public interest when powerful people actually build bridges, behave in a bipartisan way, and actually get involved in collective problem solving. Doesn't that sound radical? It really isn't radical, though, when you have exemplars of that, and that's what we have this evening. And we were thrilled when we started to work with the family of the late Senator Johnny Isakson on this concept, because for us, he epitomizes that. And it became the basis for something we're raising funds for called the Isakson Legacy Fund. The Legacy Fund has a whole set of programs associated with it, including instruction, research opportunities. We're building up that corpus of funds. We're still fundraising, so if you're interested in this concept, please come see us. And then importantly, something we call the Isakson Symposium on Political Civility. And that takes place every other year in Athens, and then on the other years, we take this story to Washington, D.C. because they really need it. But we're also thrilled to have programs like this in other places, including, crucially, right here in Atlanta. And we're just so excited tonight to have you as our honored guests. There are several folks from industry and individuals who've been supporting the Legacy Fund, so thank you very much for joining us this evening. What I'll do now is turn things back over to Dean Owen, who is a graduate of the School of Public and International Affairs, I should add.
Correct. Thank you. Well, thank you all again for being here. We are excited. As the dean said, I am a graduate of the University of Georgia, but now I'm here as a representative of the University of West Georgia, as I am dean of the University College Honors College, but part of my work is to direct the Thomas Murphy Center for Public Service. And so I want to start by saying that the Murphy Center for Public Service, the Senator Johnny Isaacson Symposium at UGA, and Georgia Tech's Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts School of Public Policy have partnered to host this event tonight so that we can talk about public service and political civility. But I also want for all the students in the audience to think about political leadership, public leadership. And so I think we can do a little bit of a historical journey and some leadership, but also how to spring forward to the 21st century now and how we can inspire them to be leaders. One of our educational values at the institution is to prepare citizens for a lifetime of responsibility and effective engagement in democratic life. And what better way to live on this value than to have two political leaders who symbolize the lifetime of participation, service, and leadership in America's democracy. So I don't think really either of you need formal introduction, but I do want to let the students know a little bit about you before we get this conversation started. So Governor Roy Barnes was elected the 80th governor of Georgia in 1998 after serving more than 20 years in the Georgia General Assembly, in the state Senate, and in the state House. He is a lawyer. He was educated at the University of Georgia and continues now to represent clients. Always in trial probably this month. And then Governor Nathan Deal was elected the 82nd governor of Georgia in 2010 after serving 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives and time in the Georgia State Senate. He is also a lawyer. He was educated at Mercer University and now is a children's book author. And if you haven't read it, you should grab a copy of the book. Thank you for being with us. But before we really start our conversation, I have to say that I'm sitting here thinking about incredible stories that you probably could share with us, political tall tales about the two men that have kind of brought us together, and that's Speaker Tom Murphy and Senator Johnny Isaacson. Both of you probably have stories of either sitting with them in the legislature, legislating with them, or having to have some kind of political conversation of back and forth and tussle. So I hope that can be weaved into this conversation. But first, I really want to just start by asking you, what motivated you to get involved in public office, public service? Why did you get drawn into this arena?
You'll start with me?
Sure, we'll start with you.
Well, my entry into the public arena was pretty much by outside pressure. I had been a young lawyer coming out of the Army. I went to Gainesville, Georgia, and practiced law there for a while. Got to be the assistant district attorney. We only had one assistant in those days, and knew a lot of people as a result of that. And there was a vacancy in the state Senate seat for the 49th senatorial seat. And I got encouraged to enter that race, and I did, and I was successful in it. So that was my entry into politics.
Hadn't thought about it before.
No, not really, not really.
Well, I was raised in Cobb County back when it was rural, believe it or not. And my daddy had a farm, but he also had a general merchandise business that my grandfather had started. And all the politicians would come by during the elections to the store, you know, sit around, talk to everybody and everything else. And I liked it. I liked seeing them and knowing who they were. So when I got out of law school and assistant district attorney and then the Army, I ran in the next election. You had to be 25 to run, and I was just over 25, almost 26 when I started to run it. And to the surprise of everybody, including me, I got elected. And Howard Overby, who was the predecessor to Nathan, Howard was chairman of the Judiciary Committee when I went there. And this is how things intertwine after years. I became chairman of the Judiciary Committee, And when I became the governor's floor leader, Nathan took my place as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So, I mean, we have been intertwined many, many years.
Right.
So you both started in the state senate, correct?
And then I ran for governor. You know, I get beat about every 10 years. Nathan beat me one time. But I ran for governor in 1990 when Zell was elected. And so one of my best friends had taken my Senate seat. So they created a new House seat in Cobb County, and I ran for it. So I've always done things backwards. I went from the Senate to the House and stayed there for 6 years.
So can you tell
Now,
me?
Tom Murphy would have said exactly right, that you got it backwards.
What he said when I walked in was, "What took you so long?"
I'm sure there were many lessons you learned from Speaker Murphy.
We could tell stories about Murphy for hours, a day or two.
So what did you learn about yourself as a candidate when you first started in politics? Or what maybe you didn't change as you developed your time in politics?
Well, I think the main thing you need to learn as a candidate is you need to listen instead of being the one that talks all the time. Because people, even though you may not think they know very much about what's going on, you'd be surprised if you listen to what they're concerned about. So I think that was the one thing that I learned. I tried so many cases as an assistant district attorney. In fact, in those days, the circuit included four counties: Hall, Dawson, White, and Lumpkin. And they only had the one DA, and I was the only assistant. And so he was disabled and couldn't try a case, so he got to strike the jury, and I got to try the cases. So I learned about a lot of people in the process of just striking, of working with the juries, but also in talking to witnesses. So I think I learned a lot about myself in the process of not only campaigning, but also in the process of representing people.
I think the greatest thing I learned, it took a while, you can't satisfy everybody. I mean, when you first get elected, you always say, well, I'm going to take care of everybody and everything else. You can't satisfy everybody. I mean, it's impossible. And what you have to do in that is to be frank with them. Mary says that I'm too blunt. And I guess that's true. I mean, you know, but I have found if you tell folks, listen, I disagree with you, I don't want to argue with you about it, but this is what I'm going to do. And don't lead them on to think you're with them, because they're going to hate you twice as much. They're not going to like it if you don't vote the way they want to, but they're going to hate you twice as much as you mislead them. They may get over it with you on, if you're frank with them. Herman Talmadge used to say, you know, Herman Talmadge, the Talmadges controlled the state for 50 years, I guess. And we were a two-party state. You're either Talmadge or anti-Talmadge. I mean, you know, we've always had that distinction. Gene and then Herman. Herman used to say that he told me after he was dying when I became governor, but I knew him very well. Buddy Darden and I went down to see him the Saturday before I was sworn in the next week, because he was not going to be able to come. He was only one of the former governors not to be able to come. And he asked me that, he said two or three things that stuck with me. One was, he says, you know, he says, I always got there early, about 4 o'clock in the morning. He says, if somebody wants to really see you, they'll be there at 4 o'clock. And he said that weeds a lot of them out. But he told me something else too, that after we had, and this has stuck with me, and it's really the change of the Democrat, Georgia being a one-party state, and then switching to another one-party state, and now, you know, it's purple or whatever you want to call it. It just depends on who shows up. But he was in the bed, and he asked the rest of them to leave, and when his voice was very weak, he told me to pull the chair up. And he told me, he says, probably nobody will come, but says, I want you and Sam Nunn to do my funeral. I said, oh, yes, Senator, they'll be there. He said, I want to tell you one other thing. I said, what's that? He says, you're the last one of us. Now, that was prophetic in many ways. I was the last Democrat that's been elected governor. But I think about that now. We have grown so much that if you stopped 1,000 people on the street out here and asked them who Herman Talmadge was or Gene Talmadge was, they wouldn't know who they was. And they wouldn't know who Roy Barnes was either. I went down to Calvin Smyre's. They had a portrait hanging for Calvin Smyre. He served almost 50 years. He's African-American from Columbus, and he was respected on both sides of the aisle. I mean, he was loved on both sides.
I spoke to him last week. He gave me a call.
Yeah. And, but anyway, I pulled up to park, and this lady, Calvin had told me where to park. This lady came up to me, and she says, and what's your name? And I said, I'm Sonny Perdue. I said, I'm chancellor of the university system. I can park anywhere I want to. She said, come right on in.
Well, I will say that for many of the students in the audience, they probably know the name Zell and Miller because of Hope Scholarship.
Sure.
However, we should be very thankful for these two governors because they continue to make sure it was funded, supported through the state in different ways. So, you might want to remember Miller, Barnes, and others deal too, so along with that. But I think you've brought up a good point. So you were the last serving Democrat for governor. That ended in 2003 in January. And so, but let's pivot. In 2010, you two found yourself running against each other because Governor Perdue was term limited, and you both had to go through a primary. And so Governor Dill, you won your runoff in the Republican primary. And then Governor Barnes, if I remember correctly, you won your primary by about 60% of the vote. So then you had to compete against one another. So what were your first thoughts when you were like, oh, I'm challenging Nathan Deal or I'm challenging Roy Barnes?
Well, Nathan called me. He was in Congress, and he said, I'm going to run for governor. And I said, fine. And I said, well, I'm running too. He said, I know, and that's the reason I'm calling you. And he said, he says, if you're the nominee and I'm the nominee, he says, we're going to have a smooth race. And we did. It was a very smooth race. I mean, compared to what happens today, it's unreal. If I've watched television during the last election cycle, you would think that 98% of Americans were transgender, and that was the only issue that there was in the world I just don't nobody's talking about education, nobody's talking about transportation, it's just all this other stuff. But it was, Nathan beat me soundly. I think I got 43, I think you got 55, and there was some 55, and there was a libertarian that I was rooting for the libertarian to take a little more for us to run off in the general election, but it didn't. 2010 was a bad Democratic year, too. It was Obama's backlash. But you never know that. I mean, I have, and I know Nathan does, too. You have folks that come to you all the time. I'm thinking about running for such and such, and what do you think? I said, let me tell you something. I said, running for public office is like getting married. If you sat around and thought about all the things that could go wrong, you would never get married. I said, you just have to dive in and see what happens and sort it out. But the worst ones is ones that come to me and says, the Lord has told me to run for public office. And I always say, next time you talk to the Lord, ask him what the Dow Jones is going to close at the end of this year. Anyway, go ahead, Nathan. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll pick up with that. I have had a lot of friends who the Lord told them to do certain things. In fact, I think I had 2 running for the same office, and the Lord had told them both to run. I never did figure that one out. But let me go back to a quick story about confusing who is who.
Yeah.
I told this story a lot of times. Right after I was first elected, I had a meeting south of Atlanta, and it was right around lunchtime. And we were going back to the Capitol, hadn't had anything to eat, so the trooper who was driving, I said, pull in at the quick, I think it was either a Wendy's or McDonald's or whatever, pulled in, and it was after the crowd had already cleared out. And so I get out of the Suburban, walk to the front door, and this lady, she greets me. She says, "Why, Governor, I am so glad to see you." And so we proceed over to me ordering my hamburger, and she's continuing to say, "Well, I'm just so glad that you came today." And was another lady behind the counter that heard this conversation, and she leans over toward the first one, and in a whisper that anybody could hear, she says, "Who is that?" And the first lady says, "Sonny Perdue." That's a true story. Very quickly, a follow-up to that about 2 weeks later, same scenario coming back. This was a little bit more crowded, closer to 12 o'clock. It was not the same store, it was another quick pickup. Go into the same store, there's a line of people. I get in line, and my security guy, he gets behind me about 2 or 3 back. And I go up, and the lady at the cash register, she gives me this knowing smile, but she doesn't say anything. So I get my tray and I go on. When my security man, who's a state trooper in a coat and tie, gets to her, she says, "I know you've been watching me." "You didn't think I knew he was the mayor, did you?" I told Kasim Reed he needed to get more familiar with his constituents. What was the question?
That was it, perfect. But no, we were talking about the 2010 because I think, Governor Barnes mentioned you called him. But then that election, and you alluded to this, it was civil. There wasn't a lot of the vitriol we see right now.
Well, you always have to watch the so-called professional people who are hired to help you.
Yeah. The ones that are doing independent expenditure.
Exactly. Those are the ones that really cause the trouble because they got the money and they come in and use the money. And sometimes they put out a message that you don't approve of.
Yeah.
Or that's embarrassing to you. And Roy and I both had that happen.
Both of us.
And my wife got so mad about what we had done. She didn't get mad at Roy about what he did. She got mad at me because one of my publicity folks had put out an ad that she thought was inappropriate, and I did too, but it happened. So you have to watch out for those who help you.
You do, but let me tell you, Sam Nudd said this once. He said, politics in Georgia is a contact sport. And there is a lot of truth to that, but there's a way for it to be. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be tough, but there's a way to do it where you don't have to hate everybody. I don't understand all of this. I mean, in the General Assembly, Nathan was a Democrat back then, but in the General Assembly, we had Bob Bell and Jim Tysinger and they were all of our friends.
Five out of 56.
5 out of 56, yeah. Paul Coverdale.
Yeah.
And Paul Coverdale and I were best friends. I mean, when he started his business, our bank loaned him the money to do it. And in fact, I did Paul's eulogy at his funeral. You don't have to hate each other. Nathan has been the same way. I mean, we all had friends on both sides. And now, there are some nuts on both sides. Don't get me wrong now. But you know what you need to do is just kind of isolate the nuts and talk to the folks that are reasonable folks. The truth of the matter is, there's not a nickel's worth of difference between Nathan and I's views. We may disagree on something, but you know why? Because we're both Georgians and we have the same interests. Sandra was a school teacher. Nathan always had a big interest in education. I did too, because Mary was a school teacher. And Mary and Sandra were big friends. And I mean, I just don't understand how you hate each other. And that's the way it is, definitely the way it is in Congress. And I hate to say it's the way it's become in the General Assembly.
Well, it's definitely different from the General Assembly where I came from when I went to Congress in the 92 election cycle. I was Democrat, and I was elected, and in 94 rolls around. 94 is the year of the Republican Revolution, the so-called Contract with America period. And for the first time in 40 years, Republicans won control of the U.S. House of Representatives, and Newt Gingrich from Georgia was elected Speaker of the House. I was still a Democrat. I got there the same time that Bill Clinton got there.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it became very obvious that the agenda that my party was presenting was contrary to what I had campaigned for. And it really became very obvious when one of the proposals of the Contract with America was welfare reform. And if you're the minority party, you generally present a bill on the same subject matter, but with different content than what the primary party is proposing. Well, the Republican Party was proposing welfare reform as part of the Contract with America. All of a sudden, I have the leadership of the Democrat Party knocking on my door and coming to see me. And I thought, well, you know, I've been through 2 election cycles and y'all have never come to see me at all. Never said hello, never did anything. In fact, Southern white conservative Democrats were not generally treated very kindly. Cynthia McKinney, who came in the same class, she was elected the Secretary-Treasurer of our freshman class. Jerry Nadler from New York, who presided over the impeachment proceedings of President Trump. His biggest, his theme was, and he bragged about it, I wondered at the time why he did, but he bragged about the fact he had more homosexuals in his congressional district than anybody else. And I got to thinking, I don't think I could say that when I went back home, and that was my claim to fame. So it was a very different atmosphere. So I went home, to finish my story about welfare reform. Here they are in my office saying, we want you to handle our version of welfare reform to counter the Republican version. And I thought, well, you haven't talked to me before now. Why are you doing this? Tell me why you want me to do it. And they hem-hawed around a little bit, and finally they said, okay, we have done the research, and you're the only Democrat that has introduced a welfare reform bill in the last 10 years. And we want to use your bill as our counter-proposal to the Republicans. Well, I was still new. I thought, well, I'll take that at face value, because I thought my bill was a pretty good bill. It was very similar to the Republican bill, but not exactly. So I said, okay. Well, I was so new, I didn't realize that what that meant was they took my bill, they gutted it, and they put all the things they wanted into it, and my bill was just the placeholder and the bill number. But I had to handle it since it was my bill on the floor of the House. The Republican version prevailed, of course, but in the process of it, I realized I'm not in the right place for what I believe in. So I went home at Easter, and my wife and I, we talked about it, and I said, you know, if I switch parties, I'll probably be beat. And her response was, well, you made a living before you got in politics. I guess you can make a living if they kick you out. Well, sure enough, I switched parties, and I've been a Republican ever since. That was in 1995. But in those days, it was beginning to get very contentious, to say the least. Nothing close to what it is now in Washington. And even though we're seeing it creep into the state legislature, it still is nowhere near, in my opinion, what we see at the federal level. Usually things start at the bottom and move up in politics. The party affiliation, in my opinion, started at the top and moved down. When I went to Congress, I had 20 counties initially, all across the top of the state of Georgia, bordered 4 states. Georgia only borders 5. They couldn't stretch mine down to touch Florida. But of those 20 counties across North Georgia, when I first went to Congress, I think there was only one member of the Senate and the House at the state level that was a Republican. When I left 17 and a half years later, there was only one Democrat left. It was a complete turnover. And it started at the top and worked its way down. And that's unusual in politics because usually movements like that start at the grassroots and move up. But the party affiliation, I don't think, did that. I know in our case it did not.
Well, I think both of you have hinted at, and changes we've seen really are hinging on relationships and people willing to build some relationships across the aisle. I kind of want to ask you now to really share with us why public service matters so much and why it's so important for America's democratic republic. And why we need to have good people go into office, service.
We have to live in this world or this nation and this state that we're living in. And if you do not participate, and that's been one of the problems we've had in the past, is that people didn't vote. They didn't go. They just thought, well, everything was fine. Now, we've had some, last 2 or 3 elections, we've had some tremendous turnouts in the state, more than I've ever seen. But it's important. The reason it's important is because you can actually make the changes that you have been talking about for all these years. You know, again, another Herman Talmadge story. I remember he told me one time, he says, you know what the difference between being governor and being a United States senator? I said, no, Governor. I mean, sunshine, I don't. He says, when you're governor, you can pick up the telephone and tell somebody to do it, and by God, they do it. He says, in the United States Senate, whatever you say is a mere suggestion. And so the problem is if you actually want to be, and the reason I wanted to run for governor was I learned pretty quickly in the General Assembly, it's the governor that sets the agenda, and the governor is one that's got the power to make the changes. And you can have all the great ideas you want to, but if they don't get picked up by the governor, they rarely ever go anywhere. And that's the reason I wanted to be, and I think it's the reason it's so important. The problem we have in the last few years is that there has been such a distrust of the institutions that we have. Now, that's true of all institutions. I sit in the Methodist Church. I see a lot of bald-headed, white-headed folks. I sit in the back in case the Lord wants to strike me. You know, I sit in the back row. And you just you cannot forfeit your responsibility to somebody else to participate in a government. You have no right to complain unless you vote and unless you get involved.
And sometimes the ones that are the most vocal critics, if you press them and ask them, well, did you vote in the last election? They drop their head and say no, and try to find an excuse for not doing so. Well, fundamentally, the answer to your question is that if we like the idea of living in a democracy, it is a system whereby the public controls the way society is run. The alternative to that is what most of the world has enjoyed for most of recorded history, and that is a strongman, a dictator, a king, you name it. Our whole country was founded on the idea that we got tired of George being our king and telling us what to do. We wanted to have the right to do it ourselves. That meant that people had to step up and be willing to, if you're going to supplant the king, you have to have a system that will manage society. Society does not manage itself without some constraints, and that's really what government is. But if you do not participate in that formation of what that system looks like, then you're just standing on the outside. You will be affected by it because the laws are going to apply to you whether you voted or not. So it is important that you participate in it. And while I'm close to the question, you probably had it down on your list a little later, I always get a lot of questions, or did when I was in public office, from young people. They'd come up to me and they would say, you know, I really want to get involved in politics, and what would you suggest that I do? Well, I always had a standard answer, and that was get a job. Get a job. Find out what the laws that are made, how they affect real people, families, businesses. And therefore, when you are elected to office, you have some understanding of what the consequences of your acts in making laws will actually be. And I think that's the one good thing, and I'm prejudiced, Roy is too, we're attorneys. I think that's one of the great things of having attorneys in a legislative body, because by the very nature of what they do, they're trained to ask the questions of what if? What are the unintended consequences of this going to be? If you have no personal understanding or familiarity with the world that you're trying to govern, you're going to not ask those questions, first of all. So it is important that everybody participate and that they be informed. That's another aspect of the whole process. How do you get your information nowadays? Well, it used to be the newspaper. They're practically all gone.
Yep.
Young people, they get it in a format and in a way I don't even understand. I am very illiterate when it comes to that. I can barely answer my cell phone without dialing the wrong number. But they are informed in very different ways. And political campaigns have acknowledged that. I mean, if you don't hire a social media person to handle your campaign and get the message out through social media, you're going to be left behind. So it is an evolving way of getting people to vote, of getting people to take positions, and getting them interested enough to actually show up at the polls. And it's tough. It's tough to do. It is expensive to do. Political campaigns have become so expensive that unless you have these big dollar third parties that nobody knows who they are and don't know where their money came from, that influence elections disproportionately, in my opinion. Now, we've tried to pass at the federal level and state level too, limits on campaign contributions and so forth. And then what happens? They invent another way of getting around that with these organizations that do not require the kind of constraints that the statutes relating to campaign finance require, because they are excluded from those. It is a complicated situation, but to answer your basic question, why is it important to be involved in civil service, public service, is that if you don't complain about the ones who do.
That's right.
You get what you either don't want, and you get what you want only if you do participate.
One of the things that bothers me, and it goes along with the attack on the institutions, and Nathan touched on it, is social media. I mean, there is, I read a newsletter that is written by Matt Lieberman, who was Senator Joe Lieberman's son. And one of the things that one of his theories is that people now, the reason they're so divided is they live in their own bubble. They can find their own social media, and whether it's correct or not, they feed on each other in that same bubble. they never have anybody from the outside that presents a contrary view. And he said, and then we wonder why people are polarized. He says it's because they don't talk to anybody else except those in their own bubble. And that's true. I mean, any organization, whether it's the church, the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, the Masons, which were all part of communities where different folks met and interacted, nobody's joining any of that now. And so what we've done is we have enclosed ourselves into our own views, and we don't want to hear anybody that has any contrary views, and that's dangerous for the country.
Well, and Governor Deal, you did touch on, which was kind of my last question, about how to motivate young people given the mistrust, the polarization, the division that we're facing. But I think to kind of circle back, as Governor Barnes, you mentioned at the beginning, you got interested in politics because of the general store and politicians coming through. And it sounds like it's the community relationships that we still need so that we can get people involved. So where do we find that today? You can't probably recreate the general store when you have Amazon.
No.
Right? So where can we invest to get back together and find that piece of community to where we do want to engage again? And I think we would meet people who do have different perspectives, and we'd have conversations that would bring us more together.
Well, I'll take a stab at this, and then Nathan, you can. I think that our educational institutions have a particular responsibility because they are used to and accustomed to students coming from all walks of life with all kinds of different views. And it's hard to tell somebody you got to join the Rotary Club, you got to join the Kiwanis Club. But generally, all young voters are connected with an educational institution that they went to or that they feel close to or they had some family connection. And I think that's where I would start. I mean, is to try to recreate community and different views and different things and try to encourage people to come. There is no magic wand for this. I mean, the only thing that generally brings us together is a crisis. Paul Coverdale and I, in 1980, we were both in the Senate. He was a Republican leader, and I was chairman of the Judiciary, and Zell was lieutenant governor. And they sent us to the Justice Department and to talk about reapportionment because we had pre-clearance back then. And I remember riding from the airport, and we went by the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Memorial. And I just mused out loud. I said, Paul, where are the Lincolns and the Jeffersons and the Washingtons today? And Paul had a very interesting observation. He says, they're out there waiting on a crisis where they can rise up and be part of the solution. I saw it after, September 11th. I mean, I was governor then, and it was one of the first time that I had seen everybody come together. Now, I don't advocate us having a crisis just so we can get everybody together, but it's going to happen. I mean, in the normal human history, we have crises from time to time. And I think that will happen, whether it's war, depression, or recession, or natural disaster, or terrorism. And when it happens, the educational institutions should have the framework that hopefully can keep that community together.
Well, Karen, I thank you for doing this and being the moderator for this, and I thank all of those administrators who made it possible for this group to be here today, because I agree with you with regard to the importance of the educational institutions. they have to be fair and open-minded too.
They do.
And that's one of the criticisms that so many people are labeling against institutions of higher learning, is that they think they're either one side or the other on the political spectrum. And I think it's important that educational institutions try to make sure that they are not, that they are impartial, that they tell both sides of the stories, because if they don't, then they're going to be labeled just like, in my mind, I label one of the organizations that we both have on both parties, and that is the political parties themselves.
Yeah.
You can't depend on the political parties to bring people together.
Yeah.
They do the exact opposite. Roy and I think had a conversation sometime back about this same thing, and we both concluded that neither of us could get nominated for governorship if we ran now.
In our primaries. I
In
agree.
our own primaries.
In our own
He
primary.
couldn't get through the Democrat primary. I for sure could not get through the Republican primary. Now, what does that mean? That means, in my opinion, and I said this one time, and I thought I'd be blasted on the news media everywhere around the country. Fortunately, that did not happen, and hope it won't happen when I say it right now. I believe the political parties are one of the biggest problems that we have in terms of reaching agreements to reach across lines. And why do I say that? There was a book written by Roland McElroy, who was the first he was the public relations guy for Sam Nunn when he ran and won his senatorship in '72. He's written a book about Sam Nunn.
Best president we never had.
The best president the nation never had. Now, when I was wrestling with my decision back in 1995 as to whether or not what to do, Sam had been a good friend of mine. I'd been his campaign manager in Hall County when he ran in '72. We were the only county north of Atlanta that he carried in that first primary. He spent the night at my house when he was campaigning. So I went over and I sat down in his office and I outlined to him, I said, you know, this is the problem I'm running into by being a Democrat in the U.S. House. I outlined all of it. I said, you know, this is happening and this is happening and this is happening. And I said, Sam, what should I do? Well, he said, what should you do? What should I do? I've got the same situation here in the Senate. Well, he had a 6-year term, and I think at that point he still had 4 years left on that 6-year term. I had 2 years, and I had to make a decision. I decided to change parties. Sam decided not to run for re-election when the next time around came. He was probably the best president the nation never had. Now, we still have that problem.
We do.
The Washingtons and the Jeffersons and the others are out there, but they can't make it through the thicket. They can't get through the forest. They don't have we always talk about stumping, a tree stump. I campaigned off a tree stump one time up in Raven County. It was there, and I thought it was an opportune time to use it, and I did. But they can't make it through the thicket of all of the clutter. And the clutter, by and large, are things that are not fundamental to the carrying on of the institutions of government. Roy mentioned it. Education, transportation, health and human services. Those are the kind of things that, well, health and human services, they've brought them into the fray now. But those are fundamental things. You don't hear candidates talk about that. They'd rather talk about AR-15s or other things that, to the average voter, do not make any sense at all. But that's what they have to put up with. That's what they have to listen to. And it's not a very pretty picture, in my opinion. We have a lot of very, very qualified young people who want to and would be able to serve with distinction. But I'm afraid until something happens to straighten out the mechanisms to get them through the processes, if they could get their nomination of their party, they could win the general election. They just can't get through the primary processes. All right, I said it.
Since you mentioned the young people, though, I do want to open up. We have a couple of students who did want to ask you questions, so if we can do that right now, I think we have a few from the university that wanted to ask something. So I want to be mindful of time and let them have their opportunity.
I will tell you this while they're gathering this. I have struggled over what to do to straighten this mess out. Nathan's right, man. We've talked about it before. The Democrats think I'm too conservative, and the Republicans thought Johnny Isakson and you were too liberal. And the truth of the matter is, there's not much difference between us. That's the way it should be, because we all have common goals.
I'm just always right.
All right, Kimberly, I think you have a question.
Yes, hello. I'm from the University of West Georgia.
Yeah.
My name is Kimberly Barker, and before I ask my question, I want to say it's been a pleasure listening to you guys recount your experiences. So during your time as governor, what are some pivotal moments that helped shape or reaffirm your leadership style?
Go ahead, Nathan.
To shape what?
Or
Reaffirm.
your
leadership style.
Powers and talents.
Well, every day there are challenges that a governor faces as to where do you stand on this policy or that policy. And you have a flock of the media always following you around with a recorder stuck in your face. And nowadays, you don't just have to deal with the media, you have to deal with the citizenry who have their video cameras and their recorders following you around. I think there are several things that come to my mind. The ultimate power a governor has in the legislative process is the power to veto legislation that has been passed by both the House and the Senate. I had a very difficult decision that I made with regard to a bill that sounded very good. That's what you better watch out for. If you see a bill that sounds really good, be careful, because it's probably not. It was the Religious Liberty Bill. Well, it sounded good on the face of it. We had substantial members within the religious community that were all for it, all pushing for it. And I vetoed it. And the reason I vetoed it was I felt like it was not representative of what Georgians really thought. It was really an issue that was trying in disguise to deal with homosexual marriage, is what it really boiled down to. But it was cloaked with all of the good-sounding religious aura around it. And I vetoed it, and the General Assembly did not attempt to override the veto. Those are the kind of real things that test the mettle of any leader, and in our case, and in this case, the governorship itself. I think that was probably illustrative of the most difficult thing that I had to do.
Zell Miller told me after I was elected and I went down to meet with him, he said, and this is so true, it's just what Nathan said. He says, you're going to make 100 decisions every day that are very tough. He says, because nobody else had the guts to make a bad call or be, a tough call. And he was right. I mean, and the press is overwhelming. They have the right to be in that, and we signed up for it. The worst thing, and I never wanted it to be this way. I had all this education reform. I had, I was going to build a way around Atlanta without getting on 285. And I was going to build it from 85 to 75, and then I was going to swing west, cross I-20, and connect into the Fall Line Freeway at Macon. We'd be riding on that right now. And I had 80% of the right-of-way between 75 and 85. I had all this stuff that I was trying to do. And then the flag came around. I had all the CEOs, at that time we had 13 Fortune 500 Fortune 500 companies, headquartered. I think we got 16 or 17 now, 18. They all came to see me at one time, and they said, "You got to do something about this flag." Pete Correll at Georgia Pacific was their spokesman. And I said, "Listen, I got my hands full. I got all this going on." I said, "I just cannot deal with this right now." And in fact, I don't mind telling you, I was a little aggravated that all of them got together to try to hotbox me. And then I went over, Mary and I went over to South Carolina. Jim Hodges was governor over there, and I went over to speak for him. He'd asked me to come over. And the trooper was taking us back to the South Carolina trooper, taking us back to the airplane. And I said, "I heard Governor Hodges last night in the governor's mansion." And he said, Governor said he hadn't slept since this flag thing. You know, they had all that flag controversy. And I called him up when I got back and to thank him for his hospitality. I said, "Tell me about the flag, Jim." He said, "I'm sitting here at the Capitol. There's 10,000 people outside." He said, "It's the worst thing I've ever been through." He said, it's paralyzed the state. So, and I knew the political danger in it. And so I decided that I had to change the flag. I didn't tell anybody. Bobby, my chief of staff, was the only one that knew until the week that we did it. Somebody said, "How'd y'all keep that secret?" Bobby told the press, he said, "We shut up the two biggest mouths in the Capitol, the governor's and mine." And anyway, the night before I did it, I went, we had the General Assembly met at the old state capitol in Milledgeville. And I went down there to speak to them. And I'd written the speech myself, and I told them, I said, in this chamber, there's some of the biggest mistakes that have ever been made. It was here that the secession convention met and decided to join the Civil War that left us devastated. It's estimated we lost about 20% of the population in the Civil War. And I said, we should never allow that to happen again. I was trying to kind of soften them up. Hell, they didn't pick it up. That night I went back to the mansion, and the only one that picked it up was Steve Porch, who was chancellor. He called me, and he was down there, and Steve called me, and he said, "Hey, what's up?" And I said, "Come to my office at 7 o'clock in the morning." And then I went downstairs in the mansion, and I met with all those CEOs. And I said, "I'm going to change the flag tomorrow." And they were shocked. And I said, "Until this is over with, all of your lobbyists are my lobbyists." I said, "I want them all in the office at 7 o'clock. And so I had Denmark Groover there. He spent the night with me. Denmark Groover had been the one that had passed the flag in 1956. And over the years, he had denied that it had anything to do with race. Of course, we knew it did. Everybody did. It was like tracking an elephant in snow. And the next morning, he came to the Rules Committee. I went with him, and he told them, he said, "I'm dying, and I want to tell you the truth." That night, I went upstairs, and Mary was sitting on in the bed reading and watching television, and I sat I said, "Move over, I need to talk to you." She always says, "I hate those conversations when you say, 'Move over, I need to talk to you.'" And I told her, I said, "I'm going to get beat in 2 years." I said, I might as well go ahead and tell you. I said, I could pull it out, but I said, it'd be mighty hard to pull it out. and this is the reason we've been married 55 years, she says, I'm ready to go home tonight. And kind of like what Sandra's told you, that she made a living before. So that was the toughest that I went through, even though I mean, like Nathan says, there is something every day. But here was, and one of the things that I regret is this. Until Nathan was activist, but a lot of the Democrats that were wanting to run for governor, they would say, just let the thing go by, because you see what happened to Barnes when you get into too much. And I understand that, and I'm sure it had an effect on the Republicans too that came, Sonny and Brian and all of them. But let me tell you something. It is not easy being governor. It is a tough job. And I can only imagine what it must be like to be president. I don't know how you do that. I mean, you know, I don't have to worry, you know, governors don't have to worry about invasions. We're pretty well at peace with Alabama right now, but, you know, I don't see how a president makes it.
It is a tough job. So I'm going to go.
May I relate another story that relates to showing what Tom Murphy did
Yes.
in a situation? Okay.
Yes, and I'm going to apologize to the students. So you tell your story, and then we'll wrap up, okay?
I'm trying to be quick. When I was first elected, I was elected to the Senate in 1980 election cycle, got there in 81. Here I am on the back row of the Senate because my number was 49 and we had 56 members of the Senate, so I was logically on the back row. My neighbor who joins me now and is my neighbor now is John Foster. He represented the 50th district.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I was so brand new that I didn't know a lot of things I should know. One day, this bill comes along, and I'd read the bill. That's one of the other things that doesn't happen a lot of times.
No.
People don't read the bills that they're voting on. I'd read the bill, and I just said, I'm not going to vote for that. So, comes up for a vote. You know, you got the board up there, and I vote no, and everybody else votes yes. Well, I hadn't even noticed that. John leans over to me and he says, you know what you just did? I said, what? He said, you voted no on that bill. I said, yes, I did. He said, do you know whose bill it was? I was so new. I opened the notebook, and they've got the sponsor's name and number, and it said Murphy 18. I was so new, I didn't know who that was. And I said, so? He said, you just voted against the speaker's bill. Well, the bill passed unanimously in the House, unanimously in the Senate, with my one exception. And it was a bill that Tom Murphy sponsored for his personal friend who was a sheriff who had been convicted, and the bill was to revoke and change the law that prohibited a prior felon from running for the office of sheriff. That's what it was. But it was a special sweetheart bill for this one particular individual. Well, after the session was over with, all of a sudden the press picked up on that, and they just started raising Cain, and Joe Frank Harris finally wound up vetoing the bill. Well, I go home, I'm practicing law and everything. One day, my members of the House, they say, we're going down to the Capitol tomorrow, and we're going to talk to Tom Moreland. We're going to try to get some highway money. That's what you had to do. You had to go pay your homage to Commissioner Moreland. And so I said, okay, I'll go with you. So I go with them. There are 3 of them House members. And they said, well, before we do that, we need to stop by the Speaker's office. And so I said, okay. So I go with them to the Speaker's office. They don't know the behind-the-scenes story. and I'd never met Tom Murphy before. I walked in his office, and those of you who have been in that office and have seen him, he was sitting behind his desk chewing on that cigar and reading something. Well, they go in and they bow and scrape as they were expected to do, and the senior member of the delegation, he says, "Mr. Speaker, I don't think you've met our new senator, have you?" And he looks up at me and he says, "You voted against my bill." Well, the others didn't know what was going on here. I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Why'd you do that?" I said, "Well, I read it and I thought it was bad law and I voted against it." The longest 2 or 3 seconds there's ever been in the history of the world, he continued to chew on that cigar and staring at me and staring at me. And then he said, "Well, that's what you ought to do."
That was Tom Murphy.
It was Tom Murphy. He said, "If you do that, you'll make a good senator." And he paid me a compliment a year or so later. He said, "You might make a good House member." But that was Tom Murphy's way of saying, if you do the right thing for the right reasons and don't let politics override it, you're doing the right thing.
Well, thank you both very much for your time and sharing your insights and stories with us. I hope tonight you have had your curiosity sparked. You've gotten a little bit more excited maybe about politics and public service. Again, let's thank our guest. Thank you. Thank you to Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia for partnering with us to have this event. We really appreciate it, and we will work to have more of these so that the system we can get together and talk more, have a good conversation. So again, thank you. Each of you have a great night.
Thank you.